They said no one wanted a fat girl. Not for marriage, not for loving, not for keeping. But when Clara Doyle stepped into that Wyoming ranch house and found a dying baby screaming in an empty crib, she proved them all wrong. The widower who owned that land had buried one woman already. He swore he'd never let another into his heart. But some women don't ask permission, they just save your life and dare you to send them away. Stay with me until the end and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach didn't slow down much when it reached the Bell Ranch. It just sort of lurched to a stop, coughed out a single passenger in her battered trunk, and rolled on before the dust had even settled. Clara Doyle stood there in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming territory stretching out in every direction like God had forgotten to finish decorating. The sky was too big, the silence was too loud, and the ranch house in front of her looked like it had given up on being welcoming about 3 winters ago. She'd expected someone to meet her. Mr. Thornton at the employment agency back in Cheyenne had promised that Mr. Samuel Bell was a respectable rancher in need of a cook and housekeeper. He'd said the pay was fair, the work was honest, and the accommodations were suitable for a woman of good character. What he hadn't mentioned was that the ranch looked haunted, or that no one would be waiting at the door. Clara picked up her trunk. She was strong enough to carry it herself, had been since she was 12 and hauling flour sacks in her father's bakery, and started toward the house. Her boots, already worn thin at the soles, crunched against the dry earth. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of horses and hay and something else. Something wrong. That's when she heard it. A baby. Crying. Not the fussy, irritated crying of a child who wanted attention. This was the desperate, ragged wailing of something in pain. Clara's heart clenched. She dropped the trunk and ran. The front door was open, not just unlocked, open, swinging slightly on its hinges like an invitation or a warning. Clara didn't pause to knock. She stepped inside and followed the sound. The house was dim and cold despite the afternoon sun. Dishes were piled in the kitchen sink. A man's coat hung crooked on a peg. And in a small room off to the side, in a wooden crib that looked hand-carved but desperately in need of fresh blankets, was a baby boy screaming himself purple. Clara reached him in 3 strides. She lifted him out of the crib, and the heat coming off his small body made her gasp. Fever. High fever. His cheeks were flushed scarlet, his little fists flailing weakly. His eyes were squeezed shut, and tears streamed down his face. "Shh, little one," Clara murmured, pressing him against her chest and starting to rock. "I've got you now. You're all right. You're all right." She hummed without thinking, an old Irish lullaby her mother had sung to her back when Clara still believed the world was kind. The baby's cries softened, became hiccups, then whimpers. She kept humming, kept rocking, and felt his burning forehead rest against her collarbone. "Who the hell are you?" Clara spun around. In the doorway stood a man who looked like he'd been assembled out of old leather and iron nails. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that hadn't seen a barber in months, and eyes that were the color of storms. His face was all hard angles and exhaustion. He stared at her like she was a ghost he hadn't asked for. "Clara Doyle," she said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was hammering. "I'm the cook, from the agency, and this baby has a fever." The man, Samuel Bell, it had to be, didn't move. He just stared at her, at the child in her arms, and something cracked behind his eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been trying everything. He won't stop crying." "Because he's burning up," Clara said, sharper than she meant to. "He needs cool water and willow bark tea if you have it, and someone to hold him who isn't falling apart." Samuel flinched like she'd slapped him. For a moment she thought he might throw her out. But then he just nodded, turned, and walked back into the kitchen. Clara followed, still holding the baby. The kitchen was a disaster. Pots with food burned to the bottom, a kettle that had boiled dry. Flour spilled across the counter like someone had tried to bake and given up halfway through. Samuel Bell moved through it all like a man sleepwalking, filling a basin with water from the pump. Clara set the baby down gently on a clean section of the table and started stripping off his sweat-soaked clothes. The boy whimpered but didn't fight her. His skin was mottled with heat. She dipped a cloth in the cool water and began wiping him down. Forehead, neck, chest, arms. Samuel watched from across the room, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "How long has he been like this?" Clara asked. 2 days. Samuel's voice was rough, scraped raw. "Maybe 3. I lose track." "And you didn't send for a doctor?" "Nearest doctor is in Laramie. That's a day and a half by horse, and I can't leave him." Clara pressed her lips together. She wanted to scold him, to tell him that was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard, but she could see it in his face, the guilt, the fear, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything else. "Does he have a name?" she asked instead. "Thomas." Samuel's voice cracked on the word. "After my father." "Well, Thomas," Clara murmured to the baby, "we're going to get you feeling better. I promise." She worked quickly, efficiently. She found herbs in a cupboard, willow bark, thank God, and chamomile and mint, and set water to boil. While it heated, she kept cooling the baby with damp cloths, humming that same lullaby, and gradually, Thomas's breathing evened out. His eyes cracked open, just for a moment, and he looked at her with the hazy confusion of a child too young to understand why everything hurt. "There you are," Clara whispered. "There's my brave boy." Behind her, Samuel made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been relief. Clara didn't turn around. She just kept working, kept soothing, until the tea was ready. She cooled it with more water and used a clean cloth to let Thomas suck the liquid from it, drop by drop. He took it, not happily, but he took it. By the time the sun started to set, Thomas was asleep in Clara's arms, his fever finally starting to break. She sat in the one chair in the kitchen that didn't have something piled on it, rocking slowly, and only then did she let herself look at Samuel Bell. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the cupboard, head in his hands. He looked like a man who had been running for miles and finally hit a wall. "You're the new cook?" he asked without looking up. Clara hesitated. She'd been hired to cook and keep house, yes, but Mr. Thornton hadn't mentioned a baby, hadn't mentioned a man falling apart at the seams, hadn't mentioned any of this. "Yes, sir." Samuel lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed. "What did Thornton tell you about this place?" "That you needed someone to cook and clean, that the pay was $10 a month plus room and board, that you were a widower with a ranch to run." "He didn't mention my son." "No, sir." Samuel laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "Figures, no one wants to come work for a man with a screaming baby and a dead wife's ghost in every room." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said the only thing that mattered. "Your son needed help. I helped him." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, really stared like he was seeing her for the first time. Clara knew what he was seeing, a big woman, broad in the shoulders and hips, with strong hands and a plain face and hair that frizzed no matter how much she pinned it back. Not the kind of woman men looked at twice. Not the kind of woman anyone called beautiful. "Why'd you come here?" Samuel asked finally. Clara met his gaze. "Because no one else wanted me, and I needed work. I'm a good cook, Mr. Bell, and I'm clean, and I'm honest, and I don't steal. But I'm also fat, and that's all most people see. So when Mr. Thornton said you needed someone, I took the job before you could change your mind." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. Then Samuel pushed himself to his feet, walked over to her, and looked down at his son sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "No one wants a fat girl," he repeated slowly, testing the words like they tasted wrong. "That's what they told me, sir." Clara held the baby a little tighter. "But I can nurse the baby. I can cook your meals and keep your house and do the work you hired me for. I don't need to be wanted. I just need to be useful." Samuel was quiet for so long, Clara thought maybe she'd said the wrong thing. Maybe she'd been too bold, too honest. Maybe he was about to tell her to leave, to take her trunk and walk back to the main road and hope another stage came through. But then he said, "Then stay." 2 words. That was all. But the way he said them, rough and quiet and something that sounded almost like gratitude, made Clara's throat tighten. "Yes, sir," she managed. Samuel nodded once, then turned and walked out of the kitchen. She heard his boots on the stairs, heard a door close upstairs, and then she was alone with Thomas, in a kitchen that smelled like sickness and burned food and the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. Clara looked down at the sleeping baby. "Well," she whispered. I guess we're staying. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn from habit. She'd been given a small room off the kitchen, probably meant for storage once, but someone had put a bed in it and a crate for a nightstand. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair back as best she could, and went to check on Thomas. He was still asleep in his crib, his fever mostly gone, his breathing even and peaceful. Clara pressed a hand to his forehead and allowed herself a small moment of relief. Then she got to work. If she was going to stay here, the house needed to be livable. And if the house was going to be livable, it needed to be cleaned. She started with the kitchen, scrubbed the burned pots until her arms ached, washed every dish and cup and utensil, swept the floor and wiped down the counters and got the stove working properly. By the time the sun was fully up, the kitchen looked like a place where people might actually want to eat. Next, she took inventory. The pantry was a mess, flour and cornmeal and dried beans all mixed together, some of it crawling with weevils. She threw out what couldn't be saved and organized what could. There were eggs in the cold cellar and a side of bacon and some potatoes that were starting to sprout but could still be used. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make breakfast. She cooked the way her mother had taught her. Simple food, done well. Bacon fried crisp, eggs scrambled with a little milk, biscuits made from scratch and baked until they were golden. The smell filled the house, warm and rich and alive. Samuel came downstairs just as she was setting the table. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the kitchen like he didn't recognize it. "Good morning, Mr. Bell," Clara said briskly. "Breakfast is ready, and Thomas is sleeping. His fever's gone." Samuel didn't move. He just kept staring. "You did all this?" It needed doing. He walked to the table slowly, almost warily, and sat down. Clara served him a plate and poured him coffee. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the eggs, and closed his eyes. "This is good," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir." They ate in silence. Not the comfortable silence of old friends, but the careful silence of two strangers trying to figure out what the rules were. When Samuel finished, he stood, put his hat on, and headed for the door. "I'll be out with the cattle," he said without looking back. "If Thomas needs anything—" "I'll take care of him," Clara interrupted gently. "That's why I'm here." Samuel paused, nodded, and walked out. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Samuel left at dawn and came back at dusk. Clara cooked and cleaned and cared for Thomas, who seemed to grow stronger every day. He started smiling when she picked him up, reaching for her hair with his chubby little fingers. She sang to him while she worked, the old songs her mother had taught her, and he babbled along like he was trying to help. The ranch hands came by sometimes, 3 of them, rough men who worked the cattle and mended fences and didn't seem to think much of Clara. She heard them talking once, standing outside the kitchen window where they thought she couldn't hear. "Boss finally got himself a cook," one of them said. "Big as a barn, that one." "Better her than no one, I suppose," another replied, "though I wouldn't want to waste food on feeding her." They laughed. Clara kept washing dishes and pretended she hadn't heard, but Samuel must have heard because that night at dinner he said, "The men were out of line today. I told them if they can't be respectful, they can find work elsewhere." Clara looked up, startled. "You didn't have to do that, sir." "Yes, I did." His voice was firm. "You're working here same as them. Harder than them, probably. They'll treat you with respect or they'll leave." Something warm and dangerous flickered in Clara's chest. She pushed it down. "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel just nodded and went back to his food. Yet, 2 weeks into her time at the Bell Ranch, Clara found herself settling in ways she hadn't expected. She knew where every pot and pan was kept. She knew which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck. She knew that Thomas liked to be bounced gently when he was fussy, and that Samuel took his coffee black and strong. She also knew that Samuel barely slept. She heard him sometimes, late at night, pacing upstairs. Once, she heard him crying, deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn out of him. She didn't go upstairs. She didn't think he'd want her to. But the next morning, she made his favorite breakfast, bacon and eggs and the biscuits he always ate 3 of, and left it on the table without a word. He came down, saw the food, and looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome, Mr. Bell." It became their language, The things they couldn't say, they said with food and silence and small kindnesses. Clara mended his shirts. Samuel fixed the loose hinge on her door. Clara left cool water by his bed on hot nights. Samuel brought in firewood without being asked. And Thomas, sweet little Thomas, grew and thrived and learned to laugh. One morning, Clara stepped out onto the porch and found a pair of worn leather boots sitting there. They were women's boots, well made but old, with careful stitching along the seams. Next to them was a note in Samuel's handwriting, messy and hurried. These were my sisters. I think they'd rather stay here. Clara picked up the boots with shaking hands. They were beautiful. Real leather, the kind that lasted. Her own boots were falling apart, held together with wire and prayer. She'd been meaning to ask Samuel if there was a cobbler in town, but she kept putting it off because she wasn't sure she could afford it. She carried the boots inside and sat down at the kitchen table. For a long time, she just held them, running her fingers over the smooth leather, and something inside her cracked open. No one had given her anything in so long, not without expecting something in return. She tried the boots on. They fit perfectly. The next day she wore them, walking through the muddy yard with Thomas on her hip, head high and heart fuller than it had been in years. From somewhere up on the hill, she felt eyes on her. She looked up and saw Samuel sitting on his horse, watching her. He didn't wave, didn't smile, but he nodded, just once, and something in that simple gesture felt like being seen, really seen. For the first time in her life, Clara thought maybe she didn't need to be beautiful. Maybe being strong was enough. The weeks turned into a month, then two. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, when the cattle needed moving, when the hay needed cutting, when the men needed extra food because the work was hard. She baked bread every other day and hung laundry on the line and kept the garden alive despite the Wyoming wind trying its best to kill everything green. She also learned about the woman who had lived here before her, Samuel's wife, Elizabeth. Clara found her things tucked away in boxes in the attic, dresses and letters and a hairbrush with long blonde strands still caught in the bristles. There were photographs, too. Elizabeth had been small and delicate, with a face like a porcelain doll and a smile that looked painted on. Clara stood in that attic for a long time, holding one of the photographs, and felt something twist inside her. She would never look like that, would never be small or delicate or doll-like. She was built for work, for endurance, for surviving, not for being admired. She put the photograph back in the box and went downstairs. That night Samuel found her in the kitchen, kneading bread with more force than necessary. "You went in the attic," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't stop working. "I was looking for extra blankets. Winter's coming." "You found her things?" "Yes, sir." Samuel sat down at the table. He looked older in the lamplight, worn down by grief and work and all the things he carried alone. "You want to know about her?" "It's not my business," Clara said. "Maybe it should be." Samuel rubbed a hand over his face. "You're living in her house, taking care of her son. You should know." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. "All right." Samuel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "She was beautiful. Everyone said so. And I believed I was the luckiest man alive when she agreed to marry me." He paused. Clara waited. But she wasn't happy. Not really. She was always worried about how she looked, about what people thought. She stopped eating much, said she needed to be thinner, prettier. I told her she was perfect, but she didn't believe me. And then Thomas was born, and she got worse. So much worse. Clara's chest tightened. She knew where this was going. "She died 6 months ago," Samuel continued. "Wasted away to nothing. The doctor said her heart just gave out. But I know the truth. She starved herself trying to be something she thought I wanted. And I didn't stop her. I didn't know how." The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. Clara reached across the table and took Samuel's hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they gripped hers like she was the only solid thing in the world. "I'm sorry," she said. Samuel looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. "You're nothing like her." "I know." "I mean that as a good thing." His voice was fierce now, almost angry. "You're strong, you're real. You take up space and you don't apologize for it. And Thomas, Thomas loves you. I see it every day. The way he reaches for you, the way he calms down when you hold him. Clara's eyes stung. He's a good boy. He is. Because you're taking care of him. Samuel's grip tightened. You're saving him, Clara. You're saving both of us. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just held his hand and let the silence speak for both of them. Autumn came hard and fast to Wyoming. The leaves turned gold and red, and the wind grew teeth. Clara spent her days preparing for winter, canning vegetables, salting meat, making sure there was enough wood stacked by the door. Samuel worked longer hours, moving the cattle to lower pastures, mending fences before the snow came. And through it all, Thomas grew. He learned to sit up on his own, to grab toys and shake them with delight. He learned to laugh, really laugh, the kind of deep belly laugh that made Clara's heart soar. He learned to say "Ma," though Clara always corrected him gently. "I'm not your mama, sweetheart, just Clara." But he kept saying it anyway, and eventually she stopped correcting him. One evening, Samuel came in from the cold and found Thomas asleep in Clara's arms as she rocked by the fire. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching, and when Clara looked up, she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked softly. Samuel shook his head. "Nothing, just you look right there. The two of you." Clara's heart did something complicated. "He's easy to love." "Yeah." Samuel's voice was rough. "He is." He didn't say anything else, but he didn't have to. The way he looked at her, like she was something precious and unexpected, said enough. "Dad." The first snow came in late October, dusting the ranch in white and turning the world quiet. Clara stood on the porch with Thomas bundled in her arms, watching the flakes fall, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She belonged here, in this house, on this ranch, with this baby in her arms and this quiet, broken man who was slowly learning to be whole again. She didn't know how long it would last, didn't know if Samuel would ever see her as more than the cook who saved his son. But for now, it was enough. Inside, the kitchen was warm, bread was rising by the stove, stew was simmering in the pot. And somewhere upstairs, Samuel was fixing the window latch she'd mentioned yesterday. This was her life now, simple and small and nothing like what she'd imagined when she was young and still believed in fairy tales. But it was hers. And that was enough. Thomas stirred in her arms and made a small sound. Clara kissed the top of his head and carried him inside, closing the door against the cold. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges. But tonight, they were warm and safe and together. And for Clara Doyle, who had been told her whole life that no one wanted a fat girl, that was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. Winter settled over the Bell Ranch like a held breath, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and unforgiving. Clara had grown up in Chicago, where winter meant coal smoke and crowded streets, and the constant noise of the city trying to keep itself alive. Here, winter meant silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat when she stood outside. It meant mornings when the pump froze solid, and she had to pour hot water over it just to get it working. It meant keeping the fires burning all night and waking every few hours to add more wood. But it also meant something else. It meant Samuel came inside earlier, stayed longer, sat at the kitchen table after dinner instead of disappearing upstairs. It meant evenings by the fire with Thomas playing on a blanket between them, reaching for his toes and babbling his mysterious baby language. It meant a kind of closeness that grew not from words but from proximity, from sharing space and warmth and the simple fact of being alive together in a place that didn't forgive carelessness. Clara worked with the same quiet efficiency she always had, but now the house responded to her touch. The kitchen gleamed, fresh herbs hung drying by the window, sage and thyme and rosemary she'd managed to coax from the garden before the first hard freeze. She'd made curtains from fabric she found in a trunk upstairs, plain cotton, but clean and bright. She'd organized the pantry with military precision and could put her hand on anything she needed in the dark. The ranch hands still whispered, but now when Samuel was around, they kept their mouths shut and their eyes down. Clara had heard him dressing down one of them, a man named Garrett who'd made a crude joke about keeping the cook warm at night, and Samuel's voice had been cold enough to freeze the words in the air. "That's the woman keeping this ranch running while you're out getting drunk in town," Samuel had said. You'll show her respect or you'll pack your gear and leave. Your choice. Garrett had chosen to stay, but he never looked at Clara again except to nod politely when she brought food out to the bunkhouse. She appreciated Samuel's protection, but she didn't need it the way he seemed to think she did. Clara had survived worse than crude jokes from cowboys. She'd survived her father drinking away the bakery. She'd survived her mother's death in the streets of Chicago and 100 jobs where people treated her like furniture. She'd learned long ago that you didn't survive by being fragile. You survived by being necessary, and she'd made herself necessary here. One morning in early November, she found Samuel in the barn before dawn, struggling with a cow that was calving wrong. She'd come out to fetch eggs and heard him cursing, saw the lantern light spilling through the barn door. "Mr. Bell," she called. "Stay back," he grunted. "This isn't something you need to see." Clara ignored him and came closer. The cow was on her side, breathing hard, eyes rolling white with pain. Samuel had his shirt sleeves rolled up and blood on his hands. The calf was stuck, presenting wrong, and the cow was tiring fast. "You need help," Clara said. "I've got it." "No, you don't." She set down her egg basket and rolled up her own sleeves. "My father kept pigs. I've done this before. Your hands are too big. Mine aren't." Samuel looked at her, jaw tight, pride warring with desperation. The cow bellowed. The decision made itself. "Tell me what to do," Clara said. He did, and she listened, and together they worked in the cold dawn, covered in blood and birth fluid, and doing what needed to be done. When the calf finally slipped free and took its first shuddering breath, when the cow lowed softly and started licking her baby clean, Samuel sat back against the barn wall and laughed, a real laugh, shocked and relieved and almost giddy. "I'll be damned," he said. "You really did help birth pigs." "Told you." Clara wiped her hands on a rag, trying not to smile too wide. "My father said I had good hands for it, strong and steady." Samuel looked at her hands, big, capable, stained with the evidence of life saved, and something shifted in his face. He was right. They walked back to the house together in the growing light, not talking, just walking side by side. When they reached the porch, Samuel stopped. "Clara." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between gratitude and confusion and maybe the beginning of understanding. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, not just the calf, everything." Her throat tightened. "You're welcome, Mr. Bell." "Samuel," he said quietly. "You should call me Samuel." It was such a small thing, just a name, but the way he offered it felt like opening a door that had been locked for a very long time. "Samuel?" she repeated, testing the shape of it. "All right." He nodded once, then went inside to wash up. Clara stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the sun rise over the frozen fields, and felt something warm bloom in her chest despite the cold. The days continued to shorten. Clara rose in the dark and went to bed in the dark, and filled the hours between with work that never seemed to end. But it was good work, satisfying work, the kind that left her tired in her bones, but content in her soul. She baked bread 3 times a week, and the smell filled the house like a promise. She made stews that simmered all day, rich with beef and vegetables and herbs. She washed clothes in water so cold her hands went numb, but she hung them on the line anyway because sunshine made them smell better than anything. And she took care of Thomas, who was growing faster than seemed possible. He was pulling himself up on furniture now, standing on wobbly legs and laughing when he fell down. He'd learned to clap his hands and wave bye-bye and give wet, sloppy kisses that left Clara's heart in pieces. Every morning when she lifted him from his crib, he reached for her and said, "Mama," in a voice full of absolute certainty. She'd stopped correcting him. It felt like lying. One evening, she was mending Samuel's shirt. He'd torn it on a fence post when he came down from putting Thomas to bed. He'd taken over the bedtime routine recently, reading to the boy from a worn Bible, even though Thomas was too young to understand the words. Clara thought he just liked the ritual of it, the normalcy. "He went down easy tonight," Samuel said, pouring himself coffee. "I think he's growing." "Of course he's growing. He eats like a horse." Clara bit off the thread and held up the shirt, checking her work. "There. Good as new." Samuel took the shirt, running his thumb over the neat stitches. "You didn't have to do that." Your other shirts all have holes too. Someone has to keep you decent. He smiled, small and quick. It was still a rare thing, his smile, and Clara had learned to treasure it when it appeared. My sister used to say the same thing, said I'd wear rags if she didn't watch me. The one whose boots I'm wearing? Yeah. Hannah. Samuel sat down across from Clara, cradling his coffee. She died 3 years ago. Fever took her fast. She was only 26. Clara set down her sewing. I'm sorry. She would have liked you. Samuel's voice went soft. She didn't care what people looked like, just if they were kind. And you are. Kind, I mean. The compliment hit Clara like a stone to the chest. She didn't know what to do with it, how to hold it without breaking it. I just do what needs doing. That's what she always said too. Samuel looked at her over the rim of his cup, and his eyes were dark and thoughtful. You remind me of her sometimes. The way you move through the world, like you're not asking permission. Clara felt her face heat. I learned a long time ago that waiting for permission means you wait forever. Smart woman. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the kind of silence that felt like a conversation all its own. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. Thomas made a small sound upstairs, then settled. The house creaked the way old houses do, adjusting to the cold. Clara picked up another shirt to mend. Samuel watched her work, and she could feel his gaze like warmth on her skin. Why'd you really come here? He asked suddenly. I know what you said before about needing work, but there's work in the cities. Why come all the way out here? Clara's hand stilled. She could lie, could give him the easy answer, but something about the quiet and the firelight and the way he was looking at her made her want to tell the truth. Because I was tired, she said slowly. Tired of being looked at like I was taking up too much space. Tired of men who thought they could touch me because I was big and therefore desperate. Tired of other women who looked at me like I was a warning about what not to become. She met his eyes. Out here, I thought maybe there'd be room for me. Room to just be. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There's room here. All the room you need. Something in Clara's chest cracked open. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and went back to her mending. The next morning, she found a pair of worn leather gloves on the kitchen table. Working gloves lined with wool, the kind that cost real money. No note this time, just the gloves. Clara put them on. They fit perfectly. She wore them all winter, and every time she looked at her hands, she thought about being seen, about taking up space, about room. December came with storms that lasted days. The ranch hands moved into the bunkhouse and didn't come out except to feed the cattle and break ice on the water troughs. Samuel worked himself to exhaustion, coming in at night so cold Clara had to practically push him into a chair by the fire. She'd have hot food waiting, soup or stew or roasted meat with potatoes, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. You're going to kill yourself, she told him one night when he stumbled in after dark, his face gray with exhaustion. Cattle need tending. The cattle will survive one day without you. You won't survive many more like this. Samuel just looked at her, too tired to argue. She brought him food and stood over him until he ate every bite. When he was done, she took the plate and said, Tomorrow you're sleeping until sunrise. I'll get the hands to cover the morning feeding. Clara, don't argue with me, Samuel Bell. I've kept this house running, and your son alive, and you fed for 3 months now. I think I've earned the right to tell you when you're being stupid. He blinked at her. Then slowly he started to laugh. Yes, ma'am. Good. She turned back to the sink. Now go to bed before you fall over. He went, but she heard him chuckling all the way up the stairs. The next morning, true to her word, she let him sleep. She bundled Thomas up warm, went out to the bunkhouse, and informed the hands in a voice that brooked no argument that they'd be covering the morning work. Boss is exhausted and needs rest, she said. Any man who has a problem with that can take it up with me. Nobody had a problem with it. When Samuel finally came down around mid-morning, Clara had breakfast waiting. He sat down without a word, and she could see the tension in his shoulders had eased just slightly. Thank you, he said quietly. Eat your eggs. He did. And when he left to check on the cattle, he squeezed her shoulder as he passed, brief and warm and gone before she could react. But she felt it for hours afterward, that small touch that said more than words ever could. Christmas approached, though it was hard to feel festive when the world was frozen and gray. Clara had never put much stock in Christmas. It had always been just another day in her life, another day to work and survive. But Thomas was here now, and even though he was too young to understand, she wanted to make it special somehow. She baked cookies shaped like stars and trees, using cookie cutters she found in the back of a cupboard. She strung popcorn on thread to make garlands. She even convinced Samuel to help her drag a small pine tree inside, though he grumbled the whole time about tracking needles through the house. "It's for Thomas," Clara said firmly. "Every child should have a Christmas tree." Samuel looked at the tree, then at Thomas sitting on his blanket and gnawing on a wooden spoon, oblivious to the fuss being made on his behalf. "He doesn't even know what a tree is." "He will someday, and he'll remember." Clara handed Samuel the popcorn garland. "Make yourself useful." He did, draping the garland over the branches while Clara arranged the cookies on the lower boughs where Thomas could see them. When they were done, they stood back and looked at their work. "It's a little lopsided," Samuel observed. "It's perfect," Clara corrected. Thomas crowed with delight and clapped his hands. Samuel smiled despite himself. On Christmas morning, Clara woke early, as always, and found a package wrapped in brown paper sitting on the kitchen table. Her name was written on it in Samuel's careful handwriting. She stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, before she had the courage to pick it up. Inside was a shawl. Not a fancy one, but wool, well-made and thick, dyed a deep forest green, the kind of shawl that would keep out the worst of the winter cold. There was a note tucked inside. "For the woman who keeps this house warm." Clara pressed the shawl to her face and breathed in the smell of wool and cedar, and her eyes burned with tears she wouldn't let fall. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and wore it for the rest of the day. She'd made something for Samuel, too, a new shirt, carefully cut and sewn from fabric she'd found in town on her one trip there in November. It wasn't fancy, but it was well made and would last. She left it folded on his chair with a note of her own. "So you don't have to wear rags." When he found it, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her across the room, and the expression on his face was so raw and grateful it made her heart hurt. They had dinner that night, roasted chicken and potatoes and pie made from preserved apples, and it felt like a real Christmas. Thomas sat in his high chair and made a mess of everything, laughing when Samuel pretended to steal bites from his plate. Clara watched them and felt something dangerous growing in her chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. After dinner, Samuel took out a fiddle Clara didn't know he owned and played a few halting songs. He wasn't very good, but Thomas loved it, bouncing in Clara's lap and shrieking with joy. When Samuel finished, he set the fiddle aside and looked at them both, his son and the woman who'd saved them, and said quietly, "This is the best Christmas I've had in years." Clara's throat was too tight to respond. She just nodded and held Thomas closer. That night, after Samuel had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Clara sat by the dying fire and let herself feel everything she'd been pushing down for months. The loneliness and the longing and the terrible, wonderful ache of caring for people who weren't hers but felt like they should be. She'd come here expecting nothing. But somehow, in this cold house on this isolated ranch, she'd found something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The question was, how long would it last? January came in cruel and bitter. The snow piled up until it reached the windowsills. The cattle huddled together for warmth. The ranch hands took turns breaking trail to the barn and back. And inside the house, Clara kept everything running with the same steady competence she brought to everything else. But something was shifting between her and Samuel, something neither of them was quite ready to name. It showed itself in small ways, the way his hand lingered when she passed him his coffee, the way she found herself watching him work from the kitchen window, the way they orbited each other in the small space of the house like planets pulled by gravity. One night, a storm came through so violent it shook the walls. Thomas woke screaming, terrified by the thunder. Clara went to him, but Samuel was already there, lifting his son from the crib and murmuring soft reassurances. Clara stood in the doorway watching them, and Samuel looked up. "Come here," he said. She did. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Samuel passed Thomas to her. The boy buried his face in her shoulder, hiccuping and scared. Clara held him and hummed her lullaby while Samuel sat beside them, close enough that their shoulders touched. "He feels safe with you," Samuel said quietly. He feels safe with you too. Not the same way. Samuel's voice was rough in the darkness. You're his whole world, Clara. You know that, don't you? She did. She'd known it for weeks, but hadn't let herself think about it too hard, because thinking about it meant thinking about the day when this might all end. What happens when you don't need a cook anymore? She asked. The question came out before she could stop it. When Thomas is older and you don't need help and… Stop, Samuel interrupted. His hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed tight. Don't think about that. Not tonight. But she had to, because the truth was settling over her like the snow outside, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. She'd fallen in love with this life, with this house and this child and this broken man who was slowly healing, and she was terrified of losing it. Thomas fell asleep between them, warm and safe. The storm raged on, and Clara and Samuel sat in the darkness, not speaking, their hands still clasped, and let the silence say what they couldn't. The storm passed. The sun came back. Life on the ranch continued in its endless cycle of work and survival. But something had changed that night, and both of them felt it. Samuel found excuses to be near her, to bring in extra firewood when she was cooking, to ask her opinion about the cattle, to sit at the kitchen table and pretend to be reading while really just watching her work. And Clara found herself responding, leaning into his proximity, laughing more easily, letting her guard down inch by careful inch. The ranch hands noticed. One of them, a younger man named Pete, who'd always been kind to Clara, pulled her aside one day when she brought food out to the bunkhouse. "Begging your pardon, Miss Clara," he said quietly, "but the boss, he's different since you came. Better. And we wanted you to know we appreciate it, what you've done for him, for all of us, really." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She just nodded and hurried back to the house before he could see her tears. That night she wrote a letter to her cousin in Chicago, the only family she had left. She told her about the ranch, about Thomas, about the work that filled her days. But she didn't tell her about Samuel, didn't tell her about the way he looked at her sometimes like she was something precious, didn't tell her about the hope that was growing in her heart like something dangerous and wild. Because hope, Clara had learned, was the most dangerous thing of all. February brought a thaw, brief but welcome. The snow started to melt, and everyone breathed a little easier, knowing the worst of winter was likely behind them. Clara opened the windows to air out the house, hung laundry on the line, let Thomas play on a blanket on the porch in the weak sunshine. Samuel found her there one afternoon, sitting on the porch steps with Thomas in her lap, both of them watching chickens peck in the yard. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. Clara smiled. "I was thinking about spring, about the garden I'm going to plant." "What will you plant?" "Everything. Tomatoes and beans and squash and carrots, herbs for cooking and flowers for…" She stopped. Flowers for what? For beauty? For herself? She'd never planted flowers in her life. "For you," Samuel finished quietly. "Plant flowers for you, Clara." She looked up at him, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. He looked at her like she mattered. "I might do that," she managed. He sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thomas babbled and reached for his father's hand. Samuel gave it to him, and the boy grabbed his finger with fierce concentration. "I'm glad you stayed," Samuel said. "Me too." They sat there as the sun moved across the sky, not talking, just being. And for the first time in her life, Clara thought maybe she understood what happiness felt like. Maybe she didn't need to be small or beautiful or the kind of woman men wrote poems about. Maybe she just needed to be exactly who she was, strong and steady and necessary. And that would be enough. Thomas fell asleep in her arms. Samuel's shoulder was warm against hers. The chickens kept pecking, and the world kept turning, indifferent to the small miracle of three people learning how to be a family. The warmth didn't last. 3 days after that afternoon on the porch, Thomas woke with a cough that rattled in his small chest like stones in a tin can. Clara heard it from her room and was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving through the dark house by memory and instinct. Thomas was sitting up in his crib, crying in that desperate way that meant something hurt. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes glassy. Clara pressed her hand to his forehead, and her stomach dropped. Fever. Again. No, she whispered. Not again. She gathered him up, and he was so hot against her it felt like holding a coal from the fire. She carried him downstairs, her mind already cataloging what she needed: cool water, willow bark tea, the herbs she'd saved for exactly this kind of emergency. She was setting Thomas on the kitchen table when Samuel appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the hour. How bad? He asked. Fever. High. And he's coughing. Clara's hands were shaking as she pumped water into a basin. I need you to get the herbs from the cupboard, the willow bark, and the... I know where they are. Samuel was already moving, his face pale but set. They'd done this dance before, back when Clara first arrived, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. They worked together in tense silence, Clara cooling Thomas with damp cloths, while Samuel prepared the tea. But this time was different. This time, Thomas didn't calm down the way he had before. He cried and thrashed, fighting Clara's gentle hands, and the sound of his breathing grew worse, wheezy and labored, like every breath was a battle. Samuel, Clara said quietly, and something in her voice made him stop what he was doing and look at her. This is worse than before. He needs a doctor. The nearest doctor is in Laramie. That's a day-and-a-half ride in good weather. Samuel's jaw was tight, and the thaw made the roads mud. I'd never make it there and back before. He couldn't finish the sentence. Then we do what we can here. Clara forced her voice to stay steady, even though her heart was pounding. We keep him cool. We get fluids in him. We don't let the fever take him. Do you understand me? We don't let it take him. Samuel nodded, his face gray. What do you need me to do? Stay with me. And don't let yourself think about anything except keeping your son alive. They worked through the night, taking turns holding Thomas, cooling him with wet cloths, trying to get him to take the tea drop by painful drop. Clara sang every lullaby she knew, her voice growing hoarse. Samuel paced when he couldn't sit still, his hands clenching and unclenching uselessly. Outside, the wind picked up again, promising another storm. Around 3 a.m, Thomas's fever spiked so high Clara could feel the heat radiating off him. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His eyes rolled back, unfocused, and Clara knew they were losing him. Samuel, she said, her voice cracking, I don't know what else to do. Samuel looked at his son, at the woman holding him, and something broke in his face. He crossed the room in 2 strides and put his hands on Clara's shoulders, his grip almost painful. Don't you dare give up, he said fiercely. Don't you dare. You saved him once. You can do it again. I'm not a doctor. I'm just... You're everything, Samuel interrupted, his voice raw. You're everything, Clara. To him. To me. So don't you dare stop fighting. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked up at him, at the desperation in his eyes, and something shifted inside her. She'd spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not worthy enough. But here was this man telling her she was everything, and she had a choice. She could believe him or she could let fear win. She chose to believe him. All right, she whispered. All right. She turned back to Thomas with renewed determination. She tried everything she could think of, different herbs, different positions to help him breathe, prayer even though she'd never been much for praying. She talked to him constantly, telling him stories about spring and gardens and all the things they'd do when he was well again. And Samuel stayed beside her the whole time, solid and present, his hand on her back like an anchor. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm that had been threatening finally broke, rain lashing against the windows. And somewhere in that miserable morning, Thomas's fever began to break. His breathing eased, his eyes focused on Clara's face. He whimpered and reached for her, and she sobbed with relief. That's it, sweetheart, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. That's my brave boy. Come back to us. Samuel made a sound like a wounded animal and pressed his forehead against Clara's shoulder. She felt his whole body shaking and realized he was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that he'd probably been holding back all night. He's all right, Clara said softly, one hand on Thomas and the other reaching back to grip Samuel's arm. He's going to be all right. They stayed like that for a long time, the 3 of them tangled together in the gray morning light, exhausted and wrung out but alive. When Samuel finally pulled back, his eyes were red and his face was wet, and he looked at Clara like she'd performed a miracle. You saved him, he said hoarsely. Again. We saved him, Clara corrected. Together. Thomas fell asleep in her arms, finally peaceful. Clara carried him upstairs and tucked him into his crib, then stood there watching him breathe, unable to quite believe the crisis had passed. Samuel came up behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Clara," he said quietly. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, raw and open and terrified and something else. Something that made her breath catch. "I can't lose him," Samuel said. "I can't. And I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I can't lose you either." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and true. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. "You won't," she managed. "I'm not going anywhere. Promise me." His voice was urgent now, almost desperate. "Promise me you'll stay. No matter what. Promise me." Clara opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Samuel did something she never expected. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She stood frozen for a moment, shocked, before her body caught up with her mind and she wrapped her arms around him too. They stood there in Thomas's room, holding each other like drowning people, and Clara felt something crack open inside her chest. All the loneliness and longing and desperate hope she'd been carrying for months spilled out, and she buried her face in Samuel's shoulder and let herself break. "I'm here," she whispered against his shirt. "I'm here, Samuel. I'm not leaving." He made a sound that might have been her name and held her tighter. They stayed like that until the light changed, until Thomas stirred and made a small sound, until the moment passed and they had to let go. When they finally pulled apart, Samuel looked at her for a long moment, his hand coming up to touch her face, gentle and wondering, like he was memorizing the shape of her. Then he turned and walked out, and Clara was left standing in the soft morning light, trembling and changed. The days that followed were strange and charged with something neither of them knew how to name. Thomas recovered slowly but surely, his appetite returning, his laughter coming back. Clara cared for him with the same steady devotion she always had, but now every moment felt weighted with meaning. Every time Samuel looked at her, every accidental touch, every shared glance across the kitchen table, it all meant something more than it had before. The ranch hands noticed the change. Pete pulled Clara aside one morning and said carefully, "Begging your pardon, Miss Clara, but is everything all right between you and the boss? He's been different." "Different how?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Pete shifted uncomfortably. "Distracted. Keeps staring off at nothing, and yesterday he asked me the same question 3 times. He paused. "Garrett says the boss is sweet on you, begging your pardon for saying so." Clara's face went hot. "Garrett should mind his own business." "Yes, ma'am. Just thought you should know people are talking." Pete looked at her seriously. "For what it's worth, most of us think it'd be a good thing. You've been good for him, for all of us." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went back to the house. But Pete's words stayed with her, rattling around in her head. People were talking. Of course they were. Nothing stayed secret in a place this small. That night, Samuel was unusually quiet at dinner. He pushed his food around his plate and barely said 2 words. Clara watched him, concerned. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. "Fine." He didn't look up. "You're not eating?" "Not hungry." Clara set down her fork. "Samuel, what's wrong?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what happens next." He finally looked up and his eyes were dark and troubled. "About you being here and what people must be saying and whether I'm being fair to you." Clara's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Samuel pushed back from the table and started pacing. "You came here as the cook, as hired help. And now you're He gestured helplessly. "You're raising my son. You're running my house. He stopped, his jaw working. "I'm keeping you here, aren't I? You can't leave because Thomas needs you, and I need you, and you're too good a person to just walk away." "I'm trapping you." The words hit Clara like cold water. "Is that what you think? That I'm trapped?" "Aren't you?" Samuel's voice was harsh now, angry at himself. "What kind of life is this for you? Stuck on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, taking care of another woman's child, working yourself to the bone for a man who—" He stopped himself. "Who what?" Clara stood up, her own temper rising. Say it, Samuel. Finish the sentence. Who doesn't deserve you? The words burst out of him like they'd been held under pressure too long. Who can't give you what you deserve? A real life, a real family. Someone who, his voice cracked, someone who isn't broken. The silence that followed was terrible. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding, and suddenly she understood. He wasn't afraid of trapping her, he was afraid of wanting her, afraid that whatever was growing between them was wrong or selfish or doomed. You think you're broken? She said quietly. I know I am. And you think I'm what? Whole? Perfect? Clara laughed, bitter and sharp. Samuel, I've spent my entire life being told I'm too much. Too big, too loud, too plain, too everything that doesn't fit into the pretty little boxes people want to put women in. I'm 32 years old and the only man who ever proposed to me did it as a joke to win a bet. Her voice shook. So don't stand there and tell me you don't deserve me. I'm not some prize you won. I'm a woman who came here because I had nowhere else to go and no one else who wanted me. That's not true, Samuel said fiercely. Isn't it? Clara's eyes burned. You hired me because I was desperate and you were desperate and neither of us had any other options. That's the truth of it. Samuel crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her shoulders. No, he said, his voice low and intense. I hired you because Thornton said you were the best cook he'd ever placed and the hardest worker he'd ever met. I hired you because I needed help and you needed work. But you stayed. You stayed, Clara, because you chose to. Because you're good and kind and strong, and you make this house feel like a home again. His hands tightened. And I want you here, not because I need a cook or Thomas needs a nursemaid. I want you here because He stopped, breathing hard. Because you what? Clara whispered. Samuel's face was anguished. Because I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. The confession hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Samuel was looking at her like she might disappear, his hand still on her shoulders, his face raw with honesty. I didn't mean for it to happen, he continued, the words coming faster now like he couldn't stop them. I told myself I'd never let anyone in again after Elizabeth, that it wasn't fair to anyone, that I'd just hurt them the way I hurt her. But then you came and you saved my son, and you brought life back into this house, and His voice broke. I can't stop thinking about you, can't stop watching you, can't imagine this place without you in it. And I hate myself for it because you deserve better than a broken widower and a ranch in the middle of nowhere and a life spent taking care of other people's messes. Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Samuel's voice was desperate. Tell me, Clara, what is this? She reached up and put her hands over his, still gripping her shoulders. It's a life, she said simply. Maybe not the life I imagined when I was young and stupid and believed in fairy tales, but it's real and it's mine and I chose it. I chose Thomas. I chose this house. And She took a shaky breath. I chose you, Samuel. I didn't mean to, but I did. Samuel's eyes widened. Clara, I fell in love with you too, she interrupted, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. Somewhere between the first night when we saved Thomas together and the morning you left me your sister's boots and all the quiet moments in between. I fell in love with your kindness and your strength and the way you try so hard to do right by everyone even when it breaks you. And yes, you're broken. So am I. But maybe that's all right. Maybe broken people fit together better anyway. For a moment, Samuel just stared at her. Then he pulled her close and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or romantic or like anything Clara had ever imagined a first kiss would be. It was desperate and clumsy and tasted like salt from both their tears. But it was real, and that made it perfect. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel pressed his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I don't know how to love someone without ruining it. Neither do I, Clara admitted. So we'll figure it out together. What if I fail you? What if I fail you? Clara cupped his face in her hands. We're both scared, Samuel. That's all right. Being scared means we have something worth protecting. He kissed her again, softer this time, and Clara felt something inside her settle. This was real. This was happening. After 32 years of being told she wasn't enough, someone was choosing her. Not despite who she was, but because of it. They stood there in the kitchen for a long time, holding each other as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them. Eventually, they heard Thomas stirring upstairs, and Clara reluctantly pulled away. "I should check on him," she said. Samuel caught her hand. "Clara, I meant what I said, about loving you." She smiled, her first real smile since the conversation started. "I know. I meant it too." She went upstairs to tend to Thomas, and Samuel stood alone in the kitchen, looking around at the home Clara had built from the wreckage of his grief. The clean counters and hung herbs and curtains she'd sewn, the warmth and life and love she'd brought back into every corner. He'd been so afraid of wanting her, afraid that it was too soon after Elizabeth, afraid that he was being selfish, afraid that he'd somehow taint something good by touching it. But Clara was right. They were both broken, and maybe that meant they understood each other in ways whole people never could. Upstairs, Clara lifted Thomas from his crib and held him close, breathing in the sweet baby smell of him. He was almost fully recovered now, babbling and reaching for her face with his chubby hands. "Your father loves me," she whispered to him, testing the words. "And I love him. What do you think about that?" Thomas gurgled and patted her cheek, which Clara took as approval. But as she stood there in the darkness, rocking the baby and thinking about what had just happened, doubt began to creep in. Samuel had said he loved her, yes, but love and marriage were different things. Love and a future were different things. What if he woke up tomorrow and realized he'd made a mistake? What if this was just gratitude twisted into something that looked like love? What if she was setting herself up for the worst heartbreak of her life? She pushed the thoughts away and focused on Thomas, on the warm weight of him in her arms. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had tonight. She had this moment. And sometimes that had to be enough. The next morning, everything felt different and the same all at once. Samuel came down to breakfast and looked at Clara like he was seeing her for the first time, and she felt her face heat under his gaze. They moved around each other carefully, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. The air between them felt charged with possibility. But they didn't talk about what had happened. Not with the ranch hands coming and going, not with Thomas needing constant attention, not with the endless work of the ranch demanding every minute. The confession hung between them, acknowledged but not discussed, and Clara didn't know if that was good or bad. 3 days passed in this strange new normal. Samuel found excuses to be near her, bringing in firewood, fixing things that didn't need fixing, asking questions about meals he'd eaten without comment for months. Clara caught herself watching him work from the kitchen window, her hands stilling in the dishwater, imagining a future she didn't quite dare to believe in. On the 4th day, Samuel came in for lunch and found Clara kneading bread with more force than necessary. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You're angry." "I'm not angry." She punched the dough harder than she needed to. "Clara." She stopped, her hands buried in the dough, and fought the urge to scream. "You said you loved me." "I do." "Then why are we acting like nothing's changed?" The words burst out of her before she could stop them. "Why are we tiptoeing around each other like we're afraid to break something? Why haven't we talked about what this means?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I'm terrified." Clara turned to face him, flour dusting her arms. "Of what?" "Of rushing you. Of pushing you into something you don't really want. Of being selfish." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Elizabeth, she did what she thought I wanted. She tried to be something she wasn't because she thought that's what would make me happy. And it killed her, Clara. I won't do that to you." The confession hit Clara hard. She'd known Samuel felt guilty about his wife's death, but she hadn't understood the depth of it until now. "I'm not Elizabeth. I know. Do you?" Clara crossed her arms. "Because it seems like you're so afraid of repeating the past that you're not letting yourself have a future." Samuel flinched. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." Clara took a breath, trying to calm down. "Samuel, I'm not some fragile thing that's going to break because you love me. I'm not going to starve myself or change myself or lose myself trying to be what you want. I'm too old and too stubborn for that. If you love me as I am, big and bossy and completely unsuitable for polite society. And if that's not what you want, then tell me now before I let myself hope for more." The silence that followed was terrible. Samuel stared at her, his face pale, and Clara braced herself for rejection. For him to say it was all a mistake, that he'd gotten caught up in the moment, that he wasn't ready for this. Instead, he crossed the kitchen and took her flour-covered hands in his. "I didn't hire you to be my mother," he said quietly, and Clara's stomach dropped because she recognized the words from the fight they'd had months ago when Thomas first got sick. "That's what I told you once. Do you remember?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I was wrong." Samuel's grip tightened on her hands. "Not about what I said. You're not his mother, not by blood. But I was wrong about why it mattered. I was angry because I was falling for you even then, and it scared me. Because Thomas already loved you, and I was starting to, and I didn't know how to stop it." Clara's breath caught. "Samuel, let me finish." His voice was urgent now. "You asked me why we're not talking about what this means. Here's what it means to me. I want you to stay, not as the cook or the nursemaid or hired help. I want you to stay as—" He hesitated, like the words were almost too big to say. "As my wife. If you'll have me." The kitchen spun. Clara stared at him, sure she'd misheard. "What?" "I'm asking you to marry me." Samuel's voice was shaking. "I know I'm doing this all wrong. I don't have a ring, and we're standing in the kitchen covered in flour, and I'm making a mess of this, but I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I love you, Clara Doyle. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you take up space without apologizing for it. I love how you sing to my son and how you keep this house running and how you look at me like I'm not broken beyond repair. And if you say yes, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Clara couldn't speak, couldn't think. Her whole body was shaking and her eyes were burning and her heart felt like it might explode. "But if that's not what you want," Samuel continued, his voice rough, "if this is too fast or too much, or if you need time, that's all right too. You can just stay as you are and I'll never mention it again and we'll—" "Yes," Clara interrupted. Samuel stopped mid-sentence. "What?" "Yes." Clara started laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, you stupid, wonderful man. Yes." For a moment, Samuel just stared at her like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief, and picked her up, flour and all, and spun her around the kitchen. Clara shrieked and clung to him, laughing and crying at the same time. When he set her down, they were both breathless and grinning like fools. Samuel cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and this time it was soft and sweet and full of promise. "I'm going to marry you," he whispered against her lips. "Yes, you are," Clara agreed. They stood there in the flour-dusted kitchen, holding each other, and for the first time in her life, Clara let herself believe in happy endings. The joy lasted exactly 3 hours before reality set in. Clara was washing dishes, her hand still trembling slightly from the proposal, when she heard boots on the porch and looked up to see Garrett standing in the doorway. He held his hat in his hands and his face was carefully neutral. "Begging your pardon, Miss Clara," he said, "but the boys and I were wondering if the boss is planning to go into town soon. We need supplies, and word is the pastor's wife is poorly. Thought maybe we should check in." Clara dried her hands on her apron. "I'll ask him at dinner." Garrett nodded but didn't leave. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "There's something else, ma'am. Word's already spreading about you and the boss." He held up a hand before she could speak. "I'm not gossiping, ma'am. Just warning you. Mrs. Fletcher at the general store has a tongue that could strip paint, and she's been telling anyone who'll listen that it's unseemly, you being here alone with Mr. Bell and the baby. Now that you two are, it's going to get worse before it gets better." Clara's stomach tightened. She'd known this would happen, but somehow having it confirmed made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Thank you for telling me." "Yes, ma'am." Garrett put his hat back on. "For what it's worth, most of us think Mrs. Fletcher should mind her own business. You've been nothing but proper, and the boss is happier than he's been since before Mrs. Bell passed. That should be enough for anybody." He left before Clara could respond. She stood at the sink, staring out the window at the gray March sky, and felt the first whisper of doubt creep back in. What would people say when they found out Samuel had proposed? Would they think she'd trapped him somehow? Used his grief and his son to secure herself a husband? Would they look at her and see a scheming woman instead of someone who just wanted to be loved? That evening, at dinner, Samuel noticed her quietness. After they'd eaten and put Thomas to bed, he found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Clara didn't look at him. "Garrett says people are talking about us." "Let them talk." "Samuel, they're saying it's unseemly that I'm—" She stopped, unable to finish. "That you're what?" His voice had an edge to it now. "Taking advantage? Is that what they're saying?" "Among other things." Clara finally looked at him. "And they're not entirely wrong. I'm living in your house, taking care of your son, and now we're engaged. To people who don't know us, it looks like exactly what they think it is." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I don't care what it looks like to them." "But I do," Clara's voice cracked. "Because I've spent my whole life being judged for how I look, and now I'm going to be judged for this too. And part of me wonders if maybe they're right. Maybe I did take advantage somehow without meaning to. Maybe you're only proposing because you're grateful and lonely and—" "Stop." Samuel knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands. "Clara, look at me." When she did, his eyes were fierce. "I'm not proposing because I'm grateful. I'm not proposing because I'm lonely or because I need a mother for Thomas or because of any other reason except that I love you. Do you understand? I love you." "I know you think you do. I know I do," he interrupted firmly. "And if you're having doubts, that's all right. We can wait. We can take all the time you need. But don't let other people's opinions make you question what we have." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to push away the doubt and just be happy. But it kept nagging at her, whispering that she wasn't good enough, that this was too good to be true, that eventually Samuel would wake up and realize his mistake. "What if you change your mind?" she whispered. Samuel's expression softened. "I won't." "But what if you do? What if 6 months from now or a year from now you meet someone more suitable and you regret—" "Clara," he said her name like a prayer. "There is no one more suitable. There's just you. And I'm not going to change my mind." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But the doubt had taken root, and she didn't know how to pull it out. That night, she lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Elizabeth. Beautiful, fragile Elizabeth who had starved herself trying to be what she thought Samuel wanted. Clara would never do that. She was too stubborn, too grounded in who she was. But was she making a different kind of mistake? Was she letting herself believe in something that couldn't last? The next morning, Samuel announced he needed to go into town for supplies. "Come with me," he said to Clara. "Both of you. Thomas needs to get out of the house, and you—" He paused. "I want people to see us together. I want them to know you're going to be my wife." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to face the stares and whispers, didn't want to see the judgment in people's eyes. But then she looked at Samuel's face, saw the determination there, and realized he was offering her something. Not just his name or his protection, but his public claim. He was telling her that he wasn't ashamed of wanting her, and that should mean something. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll come." The ride into town took most of the morning. Thomas sat on Clara's lap, fascinated by everything, pointing at birds and cattle and clouds. Samuel drove the wagon with easy competence, occasionally glancing over at Clara with a small smile. It would have been perfect if Clara's stomach hadn't been tied in knots. When they reached town, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained, Samuel helped Clara down from the wagon with careful courtesy. She felt eyes on them immediately. A woman across the street stopped sweeping her porch to stare. 2 men outside the saloon exchanged looks and muttered to each other. Samuel took Thomas from Clara and offered her his arm. "Head high," he murmured. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." They walked down the street together, and Clara felt like she was running a gauntlet. Every face turned to watch them pass. Some people nodded politely. Others whispered behind their hands. One older woman actually crossed to the other side of the street to avoid them. At the general store, Mrs. Fletcher was behind the counter, exactly as Garrett had warned. She was a thin woman with a pinched face and eyes like chips of ice. When Samuel and Clara entered, those eyes went hard. "Mr. Bell," she said with cool politeness, "and this must be your housekeeper." The pause before housekeeper was deliberate and cutting. Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "This is Miss Clara Doyle, my fiancée." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Your fiancé? How unexpected. Is it?" Samuel's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "My son needs a mother. Miss Doyle has proven herself more than capable. It seems quite logical to me." Clara wanted to sink through the floor. The way he'd said it, practical and logical, like she was a business arrangement, made everything worse. She could see Mrs. Fletcher's mind working, could practically hear her thoughts. Of course, he's marrying the help because she's convenient, not because he actually wants her. "Of course," Mrs. Fletcher said with false sweetness. "How practical of you. And Miss Doyle, you must be very pleased with your situation." The implication was clear. Clara had landed herself a husband and a home through calculated manipulation. Clara felt her face burning, but before she could respond, Thomas, sweet, oblivious Thomas, reached for her and said, "Mama," clear as a bell. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Mrs. Fletcher's lips thinned. "How sweet. The child is already calling her mother. You work fast, Miss Doyle." Something in Clara snapped. She'd been prepared to endure the whispers and judgment silently, to keep her head down and let Samuel handle it. But this woman was standing there, implying Clara had somehow stolen a dead woman's place, and she was done being quiet about it. "Yes, he calls me Mama," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "Because I'm the one who rocks him when he cries at night. I'm the one who sits up with him when he's sick. I'm the one who feeds him and bathes him and sings him to sleep. And if that makes me his mother in his eyes, then I'm honored. Because that little boy is the best thing that's happened to me in my entire life, and I don't care what anyone thinks about it." Mrs. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Samuel was staring at Clara with something like awe. And Thomas, bless him, grabbed a fistful of Clara's hair and laughed. "Now," Clara continued, "we came here for supplies. Are you going to help us, or should we take our business elsewhere?" For a moment, she thought Mrs. Fletcher might actually refuse. But then the woman's commercial instincts won out over her judgment, and she started gathering their order with tight-lipped efficiency. They left the store 15 minutes later with their supplies and their dignity intact. Samuel loaded the wagon while Clara held Thomas, and when they were done, he turned to her with a smile that could have lit the whole territory. "That was magnificent," he said. Clara felt shaky now that the confrontation was over. "I probably made it worse." "You made it better." Samuel touched her face gently. "You stood up for yourself. For us. For Thomas. That woman needed to hear it." "The whole town probably heard it." Clara managed a weak laugh. "Mrs. Fletcher isn't exactly known for keeping quiet." "Good. Let them hear it." Samuel helped her up into the wagon. "Let them all hear it. You're going to be my wife, Clara, and I'm proud of that." They were heading out of town when they passed the church. The pastor was outside talking to a group of women, and when he saw Samuel's wagon, he waved them down. "Mr. Bell," he called, "might I have a word?" Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop. Pastor Williams approached, a kind-faced man in his 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes. Clara had met him once before, shortly after she'd arrived, and he'd been nothing but courteous. "Pastor," Samuel said, tipping his hat, "I was sorry to hear your wife is unwell." "Thank you. She's improving, thank the Lord." The pastor looked at Clara, then back at Samuel. "I heard some interesting news in town today. About an engagement?" "That's right." Samuel's voice was firm. "Miss Doyle has agreed to marry me." Pastor Williams was quiet for a moment, studying them both. Then he said, "Might I speak frankly?" "Please do." "There are people in this town who are going to judge you for this, who are going to say things that aren't kind or fair." He looked at Clara directly now. "Miss Doyle, you're going to bear the brunt of it, I'm afraid. People will make assumptions about your character and your motives. It won't be easy." Clara lifted her chin. "I know. I'm sure you do. The pastor smiled slightly. I've been watching you these past months, Miss Doyle. I've seen how you care for young Thomas, how you've brought light back into Samuel's life, and I've seen how you carry yourself with dignity despite what some people say. He paused. What I'm trying to say is, if you two want to marry, I'll be honored to perform the ceremony, and anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me. The kindness in his voice made Clara's throat tight. Thank you, she managed. When were you thinking? The pastor asked Samuel. Samuel looked at Clara. Whenever Clara wants. Tomorrow, if she'll have me. Clara laughed despite herself. Let's give people a little time to adjust to the idea. Maybe in a few weeks? A few weeks, then. Pastor Williams nodded. Come see me when you're ready to set a date. They parted ways, and as Samuel drove the wagon home, Clara felt something ease in her chest. Not everyone was against them. Pastor Williams' support mattered. In a small town, the pastor's opinion carried weight. Maybe this wouldn't be as impossible as she'd feared. But that evening, reality came crashing back. They were just sitting down to dinner when someone knocked on the door. Samuel opened it to find a man Clara didn't recognize. Well-dressed, older, with sharp eyes and a calculating expression. Mr. Bell, the man said, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm an attorney from Cheyenne, and I represent the interests of the late Mrs. Bell's family. Clara's blood ran cold. Samuel's face went carefully blank. What can I do for you, Mr. Webb? May I come in? Samuel stepped aside reluctantly. Webb entered, his eyes taking in everything, the clean kitchen, the evidence of a woman's touch, Clara standing there with Thomas on her hip. His gaze lingered on her, assessing and dismissive. I'll get straight to the point, Webb said, pulling out a sheaf of papers. Mrs. Bell's parents have been receiving concerning letters from residents of this town. Letters suggesting that their grandson is being raised by a woman of questionable character, and that you, Mr. Bell, have become entangled with this woman in an inappropriate manner. That's a lie, Samuel said, his voice dangerous. Nevertheless, the Hawthorns are concerned. They've asked me to investigate the situation, and, if necessary, to take steps to ensure their grandson's welfare. Webb looked at Clara coldly. Including removing him from this environment. The room spun. Clara clutched Thomas tighter, and the boy whimpered, sensing her distress. Samuel moved to stand between her and Webb, his hands clenched into fists. You're not taking my son anywhere, he said. That's not for you to decide, Mr. Bell. The Hawthorns are prepared to petition for custody if they believe the child is in danger. He's not in danger. He's happy and healthy and loved. By a woman who is not his mother? Webb's voice was cutting. A hired servant who has, according to multiple witnesses, insinuated herself into your household and your affections with suspicious speed? The Hawthorns believe, and frankly, I'm inclined to agree, that this woman may have designs on the Bell family fortune. There is no fortune, Samuel said flatly. This is a working ranch. We're comfortable, but we're not wealthy. Nevertheless, Webb set the papers on the table. I've been authorized to offer Miss Doyle a sum of $500 to leave this territory and never contact you or the child again. Additionally, the Hawthorns would like to take custody of Thomas until such time as you can prove you're capable of providing an appropriate environment. The words hit Clara like physical blows. They were trying to buy her off. Worse, they were trying to take Thomas. She looked at Samuel and saw murder in his eyes. Get out, Samuel said, his voice low and deadly. Mr. Bell, be reasonable. I said, get out! Samuel's shout made Webb take a step back. That woman has saved my son's life twice. She's given him more love in 6 months than most children get in a lifetime. And I'm going to marry her, and there's not a damn thing you or the Hawthorns or anyone else can do about it. So you take your papers and your money and your threats, and you get off my property before I throw you off. Webb's face hardened. Very well, but this isn't over, Mr. Bell. The Hawthorns will petition for custody, and when they do, every unsavory detail of this situation will be aired in court. Your son will be taken from you, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. He left, and the door closing behind him sounded like a gunshot. Samuel stood frozen for a moment, then turned and slammed his fist into the wall, leaving a hole in the plaster. Samuel, Clara started. They can't take him, Samuel said, his voice breaking. They can't. He's my son. Clara set Thomas in his chair and went to Samuel, putting her hand on his back. They won't. You heard what he said. They're going to drag us through court. They're going to make you look like... He couldn't finish. Like what I am, Clara said quietly. A woman who came here with nothing and fell in love with your son and with you. She turned him to face her. Samuel, if they think buying me off will work, they don't know me at all. And if they think they can take Thomas just because we love each other, then we'll fight them. Together. Clara, you don't understand. If this goes to court, they'll destroy your reputation. They'll say terrible things about you. Let them. Her voice was steady now, certain. I don't care what strangers think of me. I care about Thomas. I care about you. And I'm not going anywhere. Samuel stared at her, his eyes wet. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. I don't deserve you. Probably not, Clara agreed, making him laugh despite everything. But you're stuck with me anyway. They stood there holding each other while Thomas played with his spoon, oblivious to the storm that had just blown through their lives. And Clara made a decision. She would fight for this family. She would fight for Thomas and for Samuel and for the life they were building together. And she wouldn't let anyone, not Mrs. Fletcher, not the Hawthorns, not the whole judgmental town, take it away from her. The next few days were tense. Samuel consulted with Pastor Williams and the local sheriff, trying to understand what legal rights the Hawthorns actually had. The answer wasn't comforting. As grandparents, they could petition for custody, especially if they could prove the child was in an unsuitable environment. And with half the town whispering about Samuel and Clara's unconventional arrangement, proving unsuitability wouldn't be hard. We need to get married, Samuel said one evening. Soon, before they can file their petition. If you're my wife, it makes their case much weaker. Clara had been expecting this, but it still made her stomach twist. You want to marry me to protect Thomas. I want to marry you because I love you, Samuel corrected firmly. But yes, it also protects Thomas. Is that wrong? No, Clara sighed. It's just, I always thought if I ever got married, it would be because someone wanted me. Not because I was useful. Samuel crossed the room and took her hands. Clara Doyle, you are the most infuriating woman I've ever met. You're stubborn and bossy, and you argue with me constantly. Is this supposed to be romantic? Clara asked dryly. Hush, I'm not done. Samuel's grip tightened. You're also the strongest person I know. You're kind without being soft. You're generous without being foolish. You make me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how. And when I look at you, I don't see someone useful. I see someone necessary. Someone I can't imagine living without. He paused. So yes, marrying you protects my son, but that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because I love you, and I want to spend my life proving it to you. Clara's vision blurred with tears. You really mean that? Every word. She thought about Elizabeth, about the boxes in the attic full of a dead woman's things, about the life Samuel had lived before she came, full of grief and guilt. And she thought about the life they could have now, imperfect and complicated and real. All right, she whispered. Let's get married. Samuel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. When? As soon as possible. If we're doing this, let's do it right. They went to see Pastor Williams the next day. He listened to their situation gravely, then said, I can perform the ceremony next Sunday if that suits you. It gives people a week's notice, which is respectable, and it gives the Hawthorns less time to cause trouble. Thank you, Pastor, Samuel said. Williams looked at Clara. Are you certain about this, Miss Doyle? No one would blame you for walking away. This is going to get ugly. Clara thought about Thomas's laugh, about Samuel's rare smiles, about the home she'd built from nothing. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The pastor nodded. Then may God bless you both. You're going to need it. The week that followed was surreal. Clara cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if making everything perfect could somehow ward off disaster. Samuel rode into town to file the marriage license and came back grim-faced, reporting that Webb was already asking questions and gathering testimony from anyone willing to speak against Clara. What are they saying? Clara asked. Does it matter? It does to me, Samuel sighed. That you're too familiar with me, that Thomas calling you mama is inappropriate, that you've taken over the house like you own it, that you're... He stopped. That I'm what? That you're too big to be a proper wife, that I must be marrying you out of desperation or because I need a servant I don't have to pay. His voice was hard with anger. They're saying terrible things, Clara, things that aren't true and aren't fair. Clara felt each word like a knife, but she kept her face still. She'd known this was coming. Anything else? They're saying I've dishonored Elizabeth's memory, that I moved on too fast, that Thomas should be with family who actually care about him. Samuel's hands were shaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you have to hear this. It's not your fault. Clara's voice was steady, even though her heart was breaking. They're scared of what they don't understand. A woman like me ending up with a man like you. It doesn't fit their story about how the world works. So they have to make me the villain. You're not the villain. I know that. You know that. That's what matters. Clara straightened her shoulders. Let them talk. We're getting married anyway. But that night, alone in her room, Clara let herself cry. She cried for the girl she'd been who'd believed in fairy tales. She cried for all the years of being told she wasn't good enough. And she cried because even now, even with Samuel's love and Thomas's trust, part of her still believed the things people said about her. She was still crying when she heard a soft knock on her door. Clara? Samuel's voice was quiet. Can I come in? She wiped her face quickly. Yes. He entered, carrying something wrapped in cloth. In the lamplight, he looked tired and worried and devastatingly dear. I heard you crying. I'm fine. No, you're not. And that's my fault. He sat on the edge of her bed, improper, but they were past worrying about propriety now. I should have protected you from this. Should have found a way to make people see what I see when I look at you. And what's that? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Someone extraordinary. Samuel set the wrapped bundle between them and carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside was a dress, cream-colored, simple but beautiful, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Clara stared at it. What is this? It was Elizabeth's. Samuel's voice was quiet. She bought it for our 5th anniversary. Said she'd wear it when she was thin enough, but she never... He stopped, took a breath. I found it after she died, still wrapped up, never worn. Clara's throat closed. Samuel, I can't. I mended it, he interrupted. Let out the seams, made it bigger. It's not hers anymore. It was never really hers. She bought it for a person she was trying to become, and that person didn't exist. He looked at Clara directly. But you exist. You're real and solid and here. And I want you to have it. For the wedding, if you'll wear it. Clara touched the dress with trembling fingers. It was beautiful, the kind of dress she'd never imagined wearing. Why? Because you deserve beautiful things. Because I want to give them to you. And because... His voice cracked. Because Elizabeth would have wanted this. She would have wanted someone strong to love Thomas. Someone who wouldn't break under the weight of other people's expectations. She would have chosen you, Clara. I know she would have. The tears came again, but this time Clara let them fall. She picked up the dress and held it against herself, and even without trying it on, she could tell it would fit. Samuel had taken care to get every measurement right. It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me, she whispered. Samuel touched her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb. You're the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me. You and Thomas both. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Clara felt something settle inside her. The doubts were still there, probably always would be, but so was this love that was real and complicated and worth fighting for. I'll wear it, she said when they pulled apart. For you, for Thomas, for Elizabeth, and for me. Samuel smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Then I'll be the luckiest man alive. He left her then, and Clara sat alone with the dress in her lap, running her fingers over the embroidery. She thought about Elizabeth, fragile and desperate and lost. She thought about the woman she'd been trying to become, starving herself for an impossible ideal. And she thought about herself, solid and strong and finally being chosen. Thank you, she whispered to the ghost of a woman she'd never met. I'll take care of them. I promise. The dress seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, like an answer, like a blessing, and Clara folded it carefully, placed it in her trunk, and went to sleep thinking about Sunday, when she would put it on and become Samuel Bell's wife. Sunday morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of spring day that promised warmth but delivered mostly wind. Clara woke before sunrise, as she always did, but this time her hands were shaking as she dressed. Today was her wedding day. Today she would become Mrs. Samuel Bell, and everything would change. She went through her morning routine mechanically, started the coffee, checked on Thomas, who was still sleeping, stared at the dress hanging on the back of her door. In the growing light, it looked almost ethereal, like something from a dream. She touched it once, lightly, then pulled her hand back. She wasn't ready to put it on yet. Wasn't ready to be transformed into a bride. Samuel found her in the kitchen an hour later, already dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit that made him look formal and handsome and slightly uncomfortable. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her still in her everyday dress, flour on her hands from making breakfast. "You're baking," he observed. The hands need to eat. Wedding or not, they still need to eat. Clara. Samuel came closer, took the bowl from her hands and set it aside. "You don't have to do this." Her heart lurched. "Do what? Bake? Get married. If you're having second thoughts, if this is all too much, we can—" "Stop." Clara cut him off, her voice firm despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I'm not having second thoughts. I'm just nervous. And when I'm nervous, I bake. It's what I do." Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "Terrified that I'll walk into that church and everyone will be staring at me and judging me and thinking you're making a terrible mistake. Terrified that the Hawthorns will find some way to take Thomas anyway. Terrified that someday you'll wake up and realize you settled for less than you deserved." She took a breath. "But I'm also sure. Sure that I love you. Sure that Thomas needs me. Sure that this is where I'm supposed to be. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Samuel cupped her face in his hands. "I'm terrified too. Terrified I'll fail you the way I failed Elizabeth. Terrified I'll say something wrong in front of everyone and embarrass you. Terrified that loving you this much means I have something to lose again." His thumb brushed her cheek. "But I'm also sure. So I guess we'll just be terrified together." Clara laughed, shaky but real. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "I'm working on it." He kissed her forehead. "Now go get ready. Pastor Williams is expecting us at noon, and if we're late, Mrs. Fletcher will have a field day." Clara went upstairs to change, her stomach in knots. She washed carefully in the basin, pinned her hair up with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling, and finally, took the dress from its hanger. It slipped over her head like water, settling around her body with a whisper of fabric. The fit was perfect. Samuel had measured carefully, letting out the seams so it draped properly over her curves instead of pulling tight. The cream color made her skin glow. The embroidery caught the light. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different. She was still big, still plain, still fundamentally herself. But something in her face had changed. She looked happy, hopeful. Like a woman on the verge of something wonderful instead of something she had to endure. There was a soft knock on her door. "Clara?" Samuel's voice. "Can I come in?" "Yes." He entered and stopped dead when he saw her. For a long moment he just stared, his expression unreadable. Then he said, quiet and odd, "You're beautiful." Clara's eyes burned. "I'm not, but thank you for saying it." "You are." Samuel crossed to her, and there was something fierce in his face now. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and if anyone tries to tell you different today, they'll answer to me." He pulled something from his pocket, a small box, worn velvet. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small pearl set in it. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "I know it's not much." "It's perfect." Clara's voice broke on the word. "Help me put it on?" He did, sliding it onto her finger with careful reverence. It fit like it had been made for her. Clara looked down at it, this physical proof that she was going to be someone's wife, and felt tears threatening again. "Don't cry," Samuel said softly. "You'll ruin your face." My face can't be ruined. It's already as good as it's going to get. Clara Doyle, if you insult my bride one more time, I'm going to have to defend her honor. Despite everything, Clara laughed. From who? Myself? If necessary. Samuel offered her his arm. Now come on, let's go get married before I lose my nerve. They went downstairs together. Thomas was awake now, dressed in his best clothes and babbling happily in Pete's arms. The ranch hand had volunteered to watch the baby during the ceremony, and he grinned when he saw Clara. You look real fine, Miss Clara, he said. The boss is a lucky man. Thank you, Pete. Clara kissed Thomas's forehead. You be good for Pete, sweetheart. Mama will be back soon. The word mama slipped out without thinking, but it felt right. More than right. Thomas patted her cheek and said, Mama back, and Clara's heart swelled so full she thought it might burst. The ride into town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze. It was, Clara thought, a perfect day for a wedding, even if she was terrified. When they reached the church, there were more people gathered outside than Clara had expected. She recognized some faces, the blacksmith and his wife, the doctor who occasionally rode out to check on Thomas, several of the ranch hands who'd cleaned up and come into town for the occasion. But there were others too. Curious townspeople who'd come to gawk at the spectacle of Samuel Bell marrying his fat cook. Clara felt Samuel tense beside her. Ignore them, he murmured. They don't matter. But they did matter. Clara could feel their eyes on her as she climbed down from the wagon, could hear the whispers starting up like wind through grass. She kept her head high, her hand tight on Samuel's arm, and walked toward the church door. Mrs. Fletcher was standing near the entrance, her face pinched with disapproval. Well, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I suppose some people will do anything for security. Clara felt Samuel start to respond, but she squeezed his arm and spoke first. Yes, Mrs. Fletcher, some people will. I'm marrying for love and a home and a child who needs me. What did you marry for? The older woman's face went purple. Several people nearby snickered. Samuel made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh, and Clara walked past her into the church with her head still high. Inside the church was simple but beautiful. Wooden pews, sunlight streaming through the windows, wildflowers someone had placed on the altar. Pastor William stood at the front, serene and welcoming. A handful of people were already seated. The doctor and his wife, several ranching families Clara had met in passing, and in the very back, looking uncomfortable, Garrett and two other ranch hands. But in the front pew, on the bride's side where Clara had no family to sit, were three women she didn't recognize. They were dressed well, but not ostentatiously, and when they saw Clara, they stood up. The oldest of the three, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, approached her. Miss Doyle, I'm Margaret Thompson. Pastor Williams told me about your situation, and I thought you might like some support today. She gestured to the other women. These are my daughters, Anne and Elizabeth. We'd be honored to stand with you, if you'll have us. Clara was so stunned she couldn't speak. These women, complete strangers, had come to support her, to make sure she wasn't alone on her wedding day. The kindness of it broke something open in her chest. Thank you, she managed. I thank you. Margaret squeezed her hand. Every bride deserves people in her corner. Now go on. That handsome man is waiting for you. Clara walked down the aisle on Samuel's arm, and if her steps were shaky, no one mentioned it. When they reached the altar, Pastor Williams smiled at them both. Dearly beloved, he began, and his voice was warm and clear. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel James Bell and Clara Margaret Doyle in holy matrimony. The ceremony was simple and traditional. Clara barely heard most of it. She was too focused on Samuel's face, on the way he was looking at her like she was something precious. But when it came time for the vows, her attention sharpened. Samuel, Pastor Williams said, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Samuel's voice was steady and sure, and his eyes never left Clara's face. And Clara, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Clara took a breath. This was it. The moment everything changed, she could say no, could walk away, could save herself from the judgment and the whispers and the possibility of heartbreak. Or she could choose this imperfect, complicated, beautiful life with a man who loved her and a child who needed her. I do, she said clearly. I do. Pastor Williams beamed. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride. Samuel stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame Clara's face. Hello, wife, he whispered. Hello, husband, Clara whispered back. And then he kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise, and the small congregation erupted in applause. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling so wide their faces hurt. They turned to face everyone, and Clara saw a sea of faces, some smiling, some neutral, some still disapproving. But she didn't care anymore. Let them disapprove. She was married. She was Mrs. Samuel Bell, and nothing could change that now. They were halfway back down the aisle when the church door burst open and Marcus Webb strode in, flanked by two men in expensive suits. Behind them, looking imperious and cold, were an elderly couple Clara had never seen before, the Hawthorns. Stop this ceremony, Webb announced. In the name of the court. The ceremony is complete, Pastor Williams said firmly from the altar. They're already married. Webb's face went dark. Then we'll have it annulled. These people are unfit. That's enough. The voice came from the back of the church, and everyone turned to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was small and elegant, dressed in black, with Elizabeth Bell's face and steel in her eyes. Samuel went pale. Hannah? Hello, brother, the woman said, walking down the aisle. Sorry I'm late. I would have been here sooner, but I had to come back from the dead first. The church erupted in chaos. Samuel stood frozen, staring at the sister he'd thought was dead for 3 years. Clara grabbed his hand, anchoring him, and Hannah Bell walked straight up to the Hawthorns with fury in her eyes. What exactly do you think you're doing? She demanded. Mrs. Hawthorne drew herself up. We're protecting our grandson from this woman who has clearly manipulated God. That woman, Hannah interrupted coldly, is now legally married to my brother, which makes her family. And if you think I'm going to let you swoop in and try to steal Thomas away from the people who actually love him, you're out of your minds. You're supposed to be dead, Mr. Hawthorne said weakly. Sorry to disappoint. I was in California, recovering from the fever that was supposed to kill me. I've been writing to Samuel for months, but clearly he never got the letters. She shot a look at Webb. I wonder why. Webb had gone pale. Hannah smiled, sharp and dangerous. Did you really think you could intercept my correspondence and my brother wouldn't find out? I may have been sick, but I wasn't stupid. I had copies of every letter sent through different channels, including the one where I explicitly stated that Samuel's new wife, whoever she turned out to be, had my full blessing, and that if the Hawthorns tried anything, I would personally ensure they never saw Thomas again. You can't do that, Mrs. Hawthorne protested. Actually, I can. Samuel is Thomas's legal father and guardian. I'm listed as secondary guardian in case something happens to him. And Clara is now his legal wife, which gives her parental rights as well. You have no claim here. You're just bitter because Elizabeth chose to marry Samuel instead of the banker you picked out for her, and now you're trying to punish him for her death. Hannah's voice went soft and deadly. Well, you can't, because I'm alive, and I have evidence of your harassment. And if you don't leave my brother and his family alone, I will make sure everyone in society knows exactly what kind of people you are. The silence that followed was absolute. The Hawthorns looked at each other, at Webb, at the assembled crowd watching with rapt attention. Then, without a word, they turned and left. Webb hesitated, looking like he wanted to argue, but Hannah just raised an eyebrow and he followed them out. When the door closed behind them, the entire church seemed to exhale. Hannah turned to Samuel and Clara, and her fierce expression melted into something softer. So, she said, are you going to introduce me to my new sister-in-law, or do I have to do everything myself? Samuel made a sound between a laugh and a sob, and pulled Hannah into a crushing hug. You're alive. You're actually alive. I'm alive. Hannah hugged him back, then pulled away to look at Clara. And you must be the miracle worker I've been hearing about. The one who saved Thomas, twice. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Hannah studied her for a moment, then smiled. You're exactly what I hoped for. Strong and solid and real. Elizabeth needed someone soft, but Samuel needs someone strong. Someone who won't break under pressure. She held out her hand. Welcome to the family, Clara. I'm sorry I couldn't be here sooner. Clara took her hand and something in her chest loosened. Thank you for coming, for... She gestured helplessly. For all of it. Don't thank me yet. You're stuck with me now. I plan to visit constantly and spoil Thomas rotten and generally make a nuisance of myself. Samuel was crying now, not even trying to hide it. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you. You didn't lose me. You'll never lose me. I'm too stubborn to die. Hannah looked around at the congregation, most of whom were still staring in shock. Now, is someone going to throw these two a proper wedding reception, or do I have to organize that myself too? Margaret Thompson stood up. My home is just down the street. We'd be honored to host. Perfect. Hannah linked arms with Clara on one side and Samuel on the other. Come on then, let's celebrate. It's not every day my brother marries the best thing that's ever happened to him. They walked out of the church together into the brilliant spring sunshine, and Clara felt like she was floating. Married. Safe, with a sister-in-law who'd come back from the dead to defend her. It was too much to process, too much to believe. The reception at the Thompson house was small but warm. Margaret and her daughters had somehow conjured food and drink, and people from the church filed in, curious and celebrating. Samuel kept Clara close to his side, one arm around her waist like he was afraid she might disappear. Hannah held Thomas and regaled anyone who would listen with stories about Samuel as a boy, making him blush and Clara laugh. But the best moment came when they were finally alone for a moment on the Thompsons' back porch. Samuel pulled Clara into his arms and just held her, breathing her in. We're married, he said, like he was testing the words. We're married, Clara confirmed. And Hannah's alive. She's alive. And the Hawthorns are gone. They're gone. Clara pulled back to look at him. We won, Samuel. We actually won. No. Samuel touched her face gently. I won. The day you stepped off that stagecoach and decided to stay. That's when I won. Clara kissed him, there on the porch with the spring sun warm on their faces and the sound of laughter drifting through the windows. Take me home, she whispered. Take me home to our son. They left the party early, collecting Thomas from Pete and Hannah, promising to visit in a few days once she'd settled in at the hotel. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful. Thomas drowsing in Clara's lap, Samuel's hand covering hers on the wagon seat. When they reached the house, Samuel lifted her down with careful hands. Welcome home, Mrs. Bell. Mrs. Bell. Clara's name now. Her identity. Her future. They went inside together, and Clara looked around at the kitchen she'd cleaned and organized, at the curtains she'd sewn, at the herbs hanging by the window. This was her home. Really, truly hers now. I should get dinner started, she said. No. Samuel took Thomas from her and settled him on his blanket with his toys. Tonight, you rest. I'll cook. You'll burn the house down. Then we'll eat burned food together, as a family. He pulled her close. You've taken care of us for months, Clara. Let me take care of you for one night. So Clara sat at the table and watched her husband move around her kitchen, clumsy but trying, and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. This was real. This was hers. Not because she'd manipulated or schemed or made herself small, but because she'd been herself, big and bossy and strong, and that had been exactly what Samuel and Thomas needed. The food Samuel made was terrible. The bacon was burned and the eggs were rubbery, and the biscuits were somehow both raw and overdone. But Clara ate every bite and praised it like it was a feast, and Samuel laughed and promised to stick to ranch work from now on. After dinner, they put Thomas to bed together. Samuel read from the Bible while Clara rocked the baby, and when Thomas finally drifted off, they stood over his crib for a moment, watching him sleep. He's really ours now, Samuel whispered. All ours. He always was, Clara said. We just made it official. They went downstairs and Samuel made coffee, one thing he could do competently, and they sat by the fire, not talking, just being. Clara leaned against Samuel's shoulder and felt his arm come around her, solid and sure. Tell me something, Samuel said after a while. That day you arrived, when you heard Thomas crying and came into the house without being invited. What were you thinking? Clara considered. I was thinking that no baby should cry like that alone, that whatever job I'd come here to do, it could wait until I knew he was safe. You could have just walked away, could have gotten back on that stagecoach and found work somewhere else. I could have, Clara agreed, but I didn't want to. Even then, scared and uncertain as I was, I knew this was where I was supposed to be. Samuel kissed the top of her head. I'm glad you stayed. Me too. They sat there until the fire burned low and the night grew deep around them. When they finally went upstairs, to Samuel's room now, which would be their room, Clara felt no nervousness, no fear, just rightness. This was her husband. This was her home. This was her life. Samuel helped her out of the cream dress with gentle hands, hanging it carefully so it wouldn't wrinkle. You look so beautiful today, he said. I wish I had words to tell you properly. You just did. Clara turned to face him. I love you, Samuel Bell. I love you and your son and this life we're building. And I don't care what anyone says about it. This is ours. This is ours, Samuel echoed, and kissed her like a promise. That night, lying in Samuel's arms in the bed that would be hers from now on, Clara thought about the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed no one would ever want her, who'd thought she'd spend her life alone, taking whatever work she could find, never really belonging anywhere. That girl would never have believed this was possible. A husband who loved her, a son who called her mama, a home that was truly hers, a sister-in-law who'd fought for her, a life that felt real and solid and worth fighting for. What are you thinking about? Samuel murmured against her hair. How far I've come, Clara said. How impossible this would have seemed a year ago. How grateful I am that the stagecoach dropped me off here and not somewhere else. Best day of my life, Samuel said, even if I didn't know it at the time. Clara smiled in the darkness. Mine too. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and when Clara woke before dawn out of habit, she didn't get up immediately. Instead, she lay there watching the light change, listening to Samuel breathe, and let herself feel happy. Downstairs, she heard Thomas start to wake. She slipped out of bed carefully, pulled on her robe, and went to him. He was standing in his crib, holding on to the rails, and when he saw her, his whole face lit up. Mama, he crowed. Good morning, my love, Clara whispered, lifting him out. Did you sleep well? He babbled at her, patting her cheeks with his chubby hands, and Clara carried him downstairs to start breakfast. But when she reached the kitchen, she stopped. There on the table was a note in Samuel's handwriting. No cooking today. I'm taking you and Thomas into town for breakfast. We're celebrating, your husband. Clara pressed the note to her chest and laughed. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Samuel, dressed and smiling. Breakfast in town? She asked. Breakfast in town. I want everyone to see my wife. I want to show you off. Samuel, people will talk. Let them talk. He crossed to her and kissed her firmly. Let them see that I'm the luckiest man alive, that I married the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman in the territory. Let them see that we're happy and in love and not ashamed of it. Let them see us. So they went to town, the three of them, and walked into the cafe on Main Street like they owned the place. Mrs. Fletcher was there and her mouth fell open. Other townspeople stared, but Samuel just found a table by the window, helped Clara into her chair with elaborate courtesy, and ordered breakfast like he didn't have a care in the world. And slowly, gradually, people started to smile. The blacksmith's wife came over to congratulate them. The doctor raised his coffee cup in a toast. Margaret Thompson, having breakfast with her daughters, waved warmly. Even the cafe owner, a gruff man who rarely spoke to anyone, gave them extra biscuits and refused to charge for Thomas's milk. See, Samuel said softly. The town is bigger than Mrs. Fletcher. There are good people here, people who see us for what we are. Clara looked around at the smiling faces, at Thomas happily making a mess of his breakfast, at Samuel watching her with such open love it made her breath catch. What are we? She asked. A family, Samuel said simply. A real family, finally. 3 months later, Clara stood in her garden, watching Thomas toddle between the rows of newly sprouted vegetables. He was walking now, unsteady but determined, and he shrieked with delight every time he managed 3 steps without falling. The garden was thriving, tomatoes and beans and squash, just like she'd planned, and along the fence the flowers she'd planted for herself were starting to bloom. Hannah visited often, staying for weeks at a time and helping with Thomas. She and Clara had become close, the kind of friendship forged in shared crisis and mutual respect. Samuel had never been happier. Clara could see it in the way he moved, in his easy laughter, in the lightness that had replaced the heavy grief he'd carried for so long. The Hawthorns had left them alone, just as Hannah had promised. Occasionally, Clara saw Mrs. Fletcher in town, and the woman still sniffed disapprovingly, but Clara no longer cared. She had what she needed, what she'd always needed. "Mama," Uncle Thomas called, pointing at a butterfly. "I see it, sweetheart. It's beautiful." Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" "Deliriously," Clara said honestly. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He paused. "I was thinking, dangerous occupation." He laughed and squeezed her tighter. "I was thinking that Thomas should have siblings, that this house should be full of children and noise and life. What do you think?" Clara turned in his arms to face him, her heart full. "I think that sounds perfect." He kissed her there in the garden, with Thomas playing at their feet and the flowers blooming and the whole world spread out before them full of possibility. And Clara thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how you could start in one place, alone and unwanted and convinced you'd never be enough, and end up somewhere completely different, loved and necessary and exactly where you belonged. "Thank you," she whispered against Samuel's lips. "For what?" "For seeing me, for choosing me, for letting me stay." Samuel pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "Clara, you have it backwards. Thank you for staying when you could have left, for saving us when we were drowning, for being exactly who you are." He touched her face gently. "You're the best thing that ever happened to us. I hope you know that." She did know it now. Finally, after years of doubt and fear and believing she wasn't enough, Clara knew her own worth. Not because Samuel told her, though that helped, but because she'd proven it to herself. She'd built a home from wreckage. She'd saved a child and helped heal a broken man. She'd stood up to bullies and fought for her family and refused to make herself small to please anyone. She was Clara Bell now, wife, mother, and woman who took up space without apologizing, and that, at last, was more than enough. It was everything. Thomas toddled over and grabbed her skirt, pulling himself up. "Mama, Papa, look!" They looked down at their son, and he grinned up at them with such pure joy that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Good tears this time. Happy tears. "We're looking, baby," she said. "We see you." And she did see him, saw Samuel, saw the life they'd built together from nothing but need and love and stubborn determination, saw the future stretching out before them, full of ordinary miracles and everyday happiness. The stagecoach had left her in the dust all those months ago, and she'd stood alone before a ranch where no one came to greet her. But she wasn't alone anymore. She was home, and that made all the difference.